The first time Harriet Chandler buried gold beneath her kitchen floor, her husband was still alive to help her lift the floorboards, and neither of them imagined it would still be there, untouched and unspoken of, 11 years later. It was the autumn of 1879, and the Wyoming Territory wind came down off the Laramie Range with a bite that promised an early winter. Harriet stood at her stove, stirring a pot of beans that would have to stretch 3 days if it was going to stretch at all, and she did not look at the floor beneath her feet, because she never looked at the floor beneath her feet. That was the trick of it. A woman who guarded a secret for 11 years learned not to glance at the thing she guarded, not even when she was alone, not even in the dark of night when the house creaked and settled, and she woke certain that someone was scratching at the boards with a knife. She was 34 years old, widowed for 8 of those years, and she had buried more than gold beneath her floor. She had buried the sound of her husband's voice, the shape of his hands, the particular way he used to whistle when he came in from the fields, low and off-key, so she would know it was him and not startle at footsteps on the porch. Thomas Chandler had died in the spring of 1871, thrown from a horse on a ride to town, his neck broken in a ditch not 2 miles from the house he'd built her with his own hands. He had died without telling a single soul in the territory what he had found in a dry creek bed above Deadwood 2 years before that, and he had died without telling anyone but Harriet where he had put it. Gold. Not a mine, not a claim registered with any office, but a placer strike he had panned quietly over the course of one secretive summer, terrified of claim jumpers and road agents, and the kind of men who slit throats for less than what he carried in his saddlebags. He had converted most of it to coin and paper currency in Cheyenne, trading with 3 different Asiers so no single man would know the size of what he held, and he had brought it home wrapped in oilcloth and buried it beneath the kitchen floor of the house they shared, beneath the very boards where Harriet now stood boiling beans. "We'll build slow," he had told her, kneeling in the lamplight with the boards pried up and the tin box resting in the dirt below. "We'll build slow, Harriet, so nobody wonders where the money came from, a little at a time. New fence 1 year, new stock the next. Nobody robs a rancher who looks like he's just getting by." She had agreed because it made sense, and because she trusted him with the whole of her heart, and because she never imagined she would be the one left to carry out the plan alone. 11 years, and she had spent almost none of it. A little on the roof after a hailstorm tore through in 1874. A little more when the bank in Laramie nearly took the land in the panic of 1873, though she had paid that debt in small amounts over 2 years rather than all at once, exactly as Thomas had taught her, so that no one would ask where a widow scraping by on 40 head of cattle had come by ready cash. She lived plainly. She patched her dresses. She sold eggs and butter in town and let people believe she was one bad winter away from losing everything, because that belief kept her safe, kept the wolves circling elsewhere. But the wolves were circling closer now, and Harriet knew it the way she knew a storm was coming before the first cloud showed itself over the mountains. His name was Silas Vane, and he had come to the territory 2 years before with money from somewhere back east, buying up land along the river with an eye toward the railroad spur that men said was coming, though no one seemed to know exactly when. Vane wanted Harriet's land because her section sat square across the best water on that stretch of the river, and a man who controlled the water controlled everything downstream of it. He had come to her twice already with offers, each one lower than the last, as though he expected her to grow more desperate with time rather than less. "You'll sell eventually, Mrs. Chandler," he had said the second time, standing in her yard with his hat in his hands and his eyes doing the sums on her weathered fence posts and her thin cattle. "Women alone don't last long out here. I'd rather you sold to me for a fair price than lost it to the bank for nothing. I've lasted 8 years alone, Mr. Vane," she had told him. "I expect to last a good many more." He had smiled the smile of a man who did not believe her, and ridden off, and Harriet had gone inside and sat at her kitchen table above her buried fortune and wondered how much longer she could keep pretending to be poor. It was 3 weeks after that second visit from Sela's vein that Graham Brenner rode into the small cattle town of Larkspur Creek with nothing but a tired horse, a Winchester he'd traded 2 months' wages for, and a reputation he was trying very hard to outrun. He was 29 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent a decade on horseback, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled at his collar when he went too long without a barber. He had ridden with a Texas cattle outfit for 6 years, then spent 2 more doing work he did not talk about for a rancher in the Nations who had gone bad in ways Graham hadn't seen coming, until it was nearly too late to walk away clean. He had walked away clean in the end, though it had cost him a friend and very nearly his own life, and he had been drifting north and west ever since, looking for a place quiet enough that nobody would ask him hard questions about where he'd been. Larkspur Creek was quiet. It had one street, one bank, one church, one saloon that doubled as the only place in town to get a hot meal that wasn't your own cooking, and a sheriff named Wyatt Doss who kept the peace mostly by knowing everyone's business before they knew it themselves. Graham took a room above the saloon for 2 nights while he decided what to do with himself, and it was on the second of those nights, at the bar with a glass of whiskey he was nursing slower than he wanted to, that he first heard the name Harriet Chandler. "Veins after her water again," the man beside him was saying to another, both of them ranch hands by the look of their boots. "Third time he sent an offer. She won't budge." "She's a stubborn one," the second man said. "Good woman, though. Brought soup to my mother when she was sick last winter, rode 2 hours through snow to do it. Won't matter how good she is if Vane decides to stop asking nice." Graham had not meant to listen, but a man learns to listen in places like the Nations, learns that the small talk of strangers is often the only warning you get before trouble finds you. He filed the name away without much thought and went up to bed, and might have forgotten the whole conversation entirely if fate, or something like it, had not put him on the road to Cheyenne 2 days later, the very road that ran past the Chandler homestead, at the very moment that Harriet Chandler's cattle broke through a rotted section of fence, and scattered across that road in a panic brought on by a rattlesnake in the brush. He heard the commotion before he saw it, the bawling of frightened cattle and a woman's voice raised sharp and clear above the noise, shouting commands that were, Graham noted even in the chaos, exactly the right commands, the kind a person only knew if they'd worked cattle themselves rather than simply owned them. He put his heels to his horse without deciding to. Harriet was on a sturdy little bay mare, hatless, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, trying single-handedly to turn 11 head of frightened longhorns before they scattered into the rocks along the creek, where she'd never get them back without days of searching. She saw the stranger coming at a gallop and had half a second to decide whether he was friend or thief before he swung wide around the herd's flank without being asked, exactly where she needed him, and started pushing them back toward the gap in the fence. They worked together without a single word for nearly 10 minutes, 2 riders reading each other's movements the way only people who understood cattle could, and by the time the last cow trotted back through the gap and Harriet had her horse blocking the hole until Graham could pull loose rails across it, both of them were breathing hard and covered in dust and grinning despite themselves, the particular giddy relief of a disaster narrowly avoided. "You've got a good eye for a stranger," Harriet said, once the fence was patched well enough to hold until she could do it properly. She studied him from horseback, taking his measure the way any woman alone on a homestead had learned to take the measure of every man who crossed her path. Most drifters would have ridden on by and let a woman lose her herd. "Didn't seem right riding by," Graham said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Graham Brenner, ma'am. Harriet Chandler." She did not offer her hand, but something in her face eased, just slightly, the wariness of a woman who had learned to expect the worst from men loosening by one small degree. I'd offer you supper for the help, Mr. Brenner, if you're not in a hurry to get wherever you're going." "I find I'm not in much of a hurry these days," Graham said, and it was true in a way that surprised him even as he said it. He ate supper at her kitchen table that evening, in the very room where a fortune lay buried not 3 feet beneath his boots, and neither of them had the faintest notion of how thoroughly their lives were about to become entangled with the ground they sat above. Harriet's supper was simple. Beans and cornbread and a little salt pork, the food of a woman stretching what she had, though Graham did not miss the quality of her cooking beneath the plainness of the ingredients, nor the careful way she kept the house, nor the framed photograph on the mantel of a man he correctly guessed was a husband long dead. He did not ask about the photograph. He had learned in his years of drifting that grief revealed itself in its own time or not at all, and that pressing a person for their sorrows was a poor way to earn their trust. "You're looking for work," Harriet said, more statement than question, as she refilled his coffee. "Man doesn't linger to help a stranger's cattle unless he's got no particular place to be." "I could use work," Graham admitted, "though I don't expect a widow running 40 head can afford much of a hand." "You'd expect right most months." She sat across from him, her own coffee untouched, studying him with those clear gray eyes that seemed to see a good deal more than most people's did. "But my fence needs more than a patch. My barn roof leaks when it rains sideways, and I have not slept a full night in longer than I care to admit for fear of what I'd find if I didn't check the stock at midnight. I can pay you little, Mr. Brenner, and feed you well, and give you the loft in the barn to sleep in. That's the whole of what I have to offer." "That's more than most places have offered me," Graham said, and meant it. She hired him the next morning, on a trial basis she was careful to specify, though both of them understood, without saying so, that the trial was as much about her measuring his character as it was about his ability to mend fence. Graham moved his few belongings into the loft above the barn, and within a week he had repaired every rail on the western fence line, reshingled the leaking corner of the barn roof, and begun the long, patient work of gentling a half-wild colt Harriet had bought cheap the previous spring and never had time to train. He was, Harriet came to see over those first weeks, a careful man. Careful with the animals, careful with his words, careful with the small courtesies he extended to her without ever crowding her, without ever making her feel that his help came with an unspoken price the way Sela's veins, every kindness always seemed to. He touched his hat to her each morning. He never entered the house without knocking, even though she had told him he needn't. He ate what she gave him without complaint and thanked her for it every single time, as though he had learned somewhere along his hard road not to take a warm meal for granted. And he was good with the cattle, better than any hand she could have afforded to pay properly, which made her wonder, in the quiet hours, what exactly had brought a man of his obvious skill to drifting through a town as small as Larkspur Creek with nothing but a tired horse and a rifle he'd clearly gone without meals to buy. She did not ask. Not yet. She had her own secrets buried deep enough that she understood the value of letting another person stay buried too, until they were ready to dig them up on their own terms. It was 3 weeks into his employment, on an evening when an early snow had come down out of the mountains and dusted the yard white, that Sela's Vane rode up to the house for the 3rd time, and Graham Brenner got his first real look at the man who wanted Harriet Chandler's water, and though Graham did not know it yet, wanted a good deal more than that. Vane was perhaps 50, silver at the temples, dressed in a coat too fine for ranch country, with the soft hands of a man who had made his money in offices rather than on horseback. He did not dismount when Harriet came out onto the porch, which Graham noted as the first small rudeness, and he did not remove his hat, which was the second. "Mrs. Chandler," Vane said, "I'll come to the point since the weather's turning and I've no wish to linger. My offer stands at $4 an acre, which is more than fair for land this far from the railhead, and it stands only until the 1st of the year. After that I withdraw it, and I expect the bank in Laramie will take considerably less interest in your circumstances than I have." "You've said as much before, Mr. Vane," Harriet said, her voice even, though Graham, standing by the barn door with a currying brush still in his hand, could see the tension in the line of her shoulders. "My answer hasn't changed." Vane's gaze shifted then to Graham, taking in his stance, the rifle he'd left leaning against the barn wall but which was clearly within easy reach. The whole unspoken fact of a man now living on Harriet Chandler's property who had not been there on his last 2 visits. "You've hired help, I see," Vane said, something cool sliding into his voice. "A woman alone attracts all manner of drifters looking for easy pickings, Mrs. Chandler. I'd be careful who you trust with your home." "I trust my own judgment just fine," Harriet said. "Good evening, Mr. Vane." He rode off without another word, but Graham noted the way his eyes lingered on the house itself as he turned his horse, on the chimney and the windows and the foundation, as though he were doing sums on the building the way he'd once done sums on Harriet's fence posts, and something about that lingering gaze put a cold feeling in Graham's stomach that had nothing to do with the snow. "That man wants more than your land," Graham said, once Vane was well down the road. Harriet was quiet for a long moment, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. "He wants the water," she said. "That's all it's ever been about. Whoever controls the water on this stretch of the river controls every ranch downstream when the railroad spur finally comes through, and everyone in the territory knows it's coming eventually, even if nobody agrees on when." "He looked at your house like a man pricing a coffin," Graham said. "That's not water he's calculating, Mrs. Chandler. That's something else." Harriet did not answer that, because she could not answer it without revealing more than she was ready to reveal to a man she had known for 3 weeks, however carefully he had earned her trust in that short time. She went inside, and Graham returned to the barn, and neither of them slept easily that night, though for different reasons that were, in truth, closer to the same reason than either of them yet understood. The winter deepened, and with it deepened something else, something neither Harriet nor Graham named aloud for a long while, though anyone watching them together might have named it easily enough. It was in the way Graham took to splitting extra firewood without being asked, stacking it high enough on the porch that Harriet would not have to go to the woodpile in the worst of the storms. It was in the way Harriet began setting a second cup of coffee at the table each morning before Graham even came in from the barn, as though some part of her had stopped thinking of him as help and started thinking of him as someone whose presence she simply expected, the way one expects the sun to rise. It was in small conversations that stretched longer than they needed to, over supper, over mending, over the long quiet evenings when the snow kept them both inside, and there was nothing to do but talk. Graham told her in pieces about Texas, about the outfit he'd ridden with, about the friend he'd lost in the nations, a young cowhand named Jesse who had trusted the wrong rancher, and paid for it with his life in a dispute over stolen cattle that had turned, in the space of one terrible night, into gunfire. Graham had ridden away from that outfit the next morning and never looked back, and something in his voice when he spoke of it told Harriet that the guilt of having survived when Jesse had not still sat heavy on him, even now. "You couldn't have known," Harriet told him, one such evening, her hand still on the shirt she was mending. "A man can't carry the whole of the world's harm on his own back, Mr. Brenner. You'd break under the weight of it." "Some days I feel I already have," Graham admitted, and it was the most honest thing he had said to her yet. She told him in her own pieces about Thomas. Not everything, not the gold, not the boards beneath the kitchen floor, but the man himself, his laugh, his patience, the way he had built the house they now sat in with lumber he'd hauled himself from 40 miles away because he wanted it sturdy enough to last her whole life, however long that life turned out to be. She told Graham about the morning she had learned of the accident, how the sheriff at the time had come himself to tell her, hat in his hands, unable to look her in the eye, and how she had not cried until 3 days later at the funeral, when the whole weight of it finally broke through the numbness. "I built this ranch up from almost nothing after that," she said. 40 head of cattle, most winters just barely surviving. People in town think I'm one bad season from losing everything, and most years that's near enough the truth. It was not the whole truth, but it was close enough to true that she did not feel she was lying to him, and Graham, listening, felt something in his chest that he recognized, uneasily, as the early shape of love, though he told himself firmly that a drifter with his history had no business feeling such a thing for a woman who deserved a man without a shadow trailing behind him. But feelings, once they take root, are not so easily reasoned away, and by the time the snow began to melt into an early spring, both Harriet Chandler and Graham Brenner had stopped pretending, even to themselves, that what sat between them was merely the easy comfort of an employer and her hired hand. It was a night in March, with the creek running high from the melt and the first green just beginning to show along its banks, that everything Harriet had spent 11 years protecting nearly came apart, and it came apart because of the very man she had begun, against all her careful instincts, to fall in love with. Graham had gone into the house that evening to fetch a lantern from the kitchen while Harriet finished latching the barn, and in reaching for the lantern on the shelf above the stove, his boot heel caught the edge of a floorboard that gave, ever so slightly, beneath his weight. A small hollow give that a man who had spent years reading the ground beneath cattle and horses noticed immediately, the way he might notice a hidden gopher hole in a pasture. He knelt without thinking and pressed his palm against the board, feeling the faint looseness of it, the telltale sign of wood that had been lifted and reset more than once. He was still kneeling there, puzzling over it in the lantern light, when Harriet came through the door and saw him, and something in her face went so pale and so still that Graham knew at once he had stumbled onto something she had never meant for him to find. "Mr. Brenner," she said, and her voice had a tightness in it he had not heard before, not even the day Vane had ridden up with his cold offers. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," Graham said, rising quickly, though it was too late for the lie to hold. "I caught my boot on a loose board. Didn't mean to pry into anything, Mrs. Chandler, I swear it." She stood in the doorway with her hand still on the latch, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, the silence stretching thin enough that Graham could hear his own heartbeat. He watched her weigh something behind her eyes, some decision that had clearly been building for weeks, maybe longer, and he had the strange, certain sense that whatever she decided in the next handful of seconds would determine the whole shape of what came after between them. "Sit down, Mr. Brenner," Harriet said finally, closing the door behind her. "I think it's time I told you something I have never told another living soul." He sat. She did not right away. She stood by the stove with her arms crossed tight against herself, gathering the words the way a person gathers courage before stepping off a high place into deep water. "My husband found gold," she said at last, "above Deadwood in the summer of '69, on a creek that never had a claim filed against it because Thomas never told a soul he'd found anything worth finding. He panned it quiet, over one whole season, terrified every day that someone would follow him up that creek and slit his throat for it. He converted most of it to coin in Cheyenne, using 3 different osiers so no one man would know how much he carried. And then he brought it home, and we buried it beneath this floor, and he told me we would use it slow, a little at a time, so no one would ever wonder where a small rancher's money was coming from." Graham sat very still, listening, understanding now the weight he had felt in her these past months, the careful poverty of her life that had never quite matched the quiet dignity beneath it. "He died before we'd used more than a fraction of it," Harriet went on. "And I have spent 11 years living like a woman on the edge of ruin, because the moment anyone in this territory suspected I had money buried beneath my floor, I would not have a night's peace left to me. Men would come. Thieves, certainly, but worse than thieves, Men who would smile at me in the daylight and slit my throat in my sleep for a fraction of what's down there. Sela's vein, Graham said slowly, the pieces settling into place with the terrible clarity of a puzzle finally solved. That's why he looked at your house the way he did. He's not just after your water. I don't know how he could know, Harriet said, and for the first time since Graham had known her, her composure cracked just slightly at the edges. But he's asked me 3 times for land he could have for a fraction of what he's offering elsewhere in the territory, and each time he looks at this house like he's pricing it for something more than pasture. I've told myself it's only the water. I've told myself that every night for 2 years, but I don't fully believe it anymore, and I haven't for some time. Graham rose from his chair slowly and crossed the small kitchen to stand near her, though he was careful, even now, not to crowd her. "Harriet," he said, and it was the first time he had used her Christian name rather than the formal address he'd kept between them for months. "I won't pretend I understand everything that's sitting beneath these boards, or what it means to carry a secret like that alone for 11 years. But I can tell you this much plainly. I am not leaving you to face Sela's vein on your own, not now that I know what's truly at stake here, and not for any reason short of you telling me to go." Her eyes came up to his, glassy with unshed tears she was too proud to let fall, and something passed between them in that lantern-lit kitchen that was not merely gratitude, and not merely the relief of a burden finally shared, but something deeper, something that had been building quietly between them since the day he'd ridden into her scattering cattle and turned them back toward home. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she whispered. "I've told no one. Not the sheriff, not the bank, not a single soul in 11 years. Maybe," Graham said gently, "you're telling me because some part of you already trusts me more than you've let yourself admit." She did not answer that, not in words, but she did not step away from him either, and when his hand came up slowly to rest against her cheek, she leaned into it the way a person leans into warmth after a long cold winter, and the kiss that followed was soft and searching and long overdue. 11 years of loneliness and 3 weeks of careful, guarded trust finally breaking open into something neither of them could any longer deny. They did not speak of the gold again that night, not directly, though it sat between them in a new way now. No longer a secret Harriet carried alone but a burden shared. And shared burdens, Harriet was beginning to learn, weighed less than solitary ones, however heavy the gold itself might have been. Spring deepened into the kind of long, golden days that made a person almost forget the hardness of a Wyoming winter. And with the change of season came a change in Harriet and Graham's life together that neither of them announced but both of them understood. Graham no longer slept in the barn loft out of mere practicality. He slept there still, because propriety demanded it, and Harriet was not a woman to abandon propriety even for love. But he took his meals with her at every hour of the day now, rather than only supper, and the two of them fell into an easy partnership on the ranch that made the work lighter for both of them in a way Harriet had almost forgotten work could be. They talked in the evenings about what might be done with the fortune buried beneath the kitchen floor, now that Graham knew of it. Harriet had spent so many years thinking only of hiding it that she had nearly forgotten how to think of using it. "Could pay off whatever's owed at the bank outright," Graham suggested one evening, "and be done with worrying about foreclosure at all. And have every man in Laramie asking where a widow with 40 head of cattle came by that kind of money all at once," Harriet said. "No, Thomas was right about that much. It has to come slow or not at all." "Then we do it slow," Graham said, and the word we settled into the conversation so naturally that neither of them remarked upon it, though both of them noticed. They agreed in the end on a careful plan. A little more stock, bought over the course of the coming year from different sellers in different towns, so no single purchase looked suspicious. New fence, proper fence, replacing the patched and rotting rails a section at a time. And quietly a payment to the bank in Laramie large enough to clear the small remaining debt on the land outright, but arranged in a manner that would look, to any curious eye, like the ordinary proceeds of a good cattle season rather than a sudden windfall. It was a good plan, a careful plan. The kind of plan Thomas Chandler himself might have approved of, and it might have worked exactly as intended if Silas Vane had not, in the last week of April, finally shown his true hand. It began with a man Harriet did not recognize, riding through Larkspur Creek asking careful questions at the general store and the saloon, questions dressed up as idle curiosity about the history of the Chandler place, about old Thomas Chandler, and the year he'd supposedly struck it rich enough to build such a sturdy house on a rancher's income, about whether anyone had ever heard tales of gold coming out of the Black Hills country that summer of '69. The storekeeper, a talkative man named Ezra Poole who meant no harm by it, mentioned the questions to Sheriff Wyatt Doss almost in passing, and the sheriff, who had a good deal more sense than Ezra Poole gave him credit for, rode out to the Chandler ranch himself to pass along the warning. "Don't know what it means, Mrs. Chandler," Doss said, standing in her yard with his hat in his hands in a far more respectful posture than Vane ever managed. "But a stranger asking after your late husband's finances 11 years back, right around the same time Silas Vane's been sniffing at your land, that's not a coincidence I'm comfortable with. You've got someone watching this place close, and I'd wager good money it's on Vane's payroll." Harriet thanked the sheriff and said nothing more than that, though her face had gone the same pale, careful stillness Graham had seen the night he'd found the loose floorboard, and once Doss had ridden off, she turned to Graham with a fear in her eyes that went beyond anything Silas Vane's cold offers had ever produced in her before. "He knows," she said. "Or he's close enough to knowing that it hardly matters anymore whether he's certain. A man like Vane doesn't need proof, Graham. He only needs enough suspicion to justify whatever he decides to do next." "Then we move faster than we planned," Graham said. "We get to the bank, we settle what's owed, and we do it before he does whatever it is he's building toward." But moving faster, as it turned out, was not fast enough. 3 nights later, under a moon thin enough to hide most of the yard in shadow, 2 riders came onto Harriet's property with the clear intent of men who had not come to talk. Graham heard them first, from the barn loft, the soft creak of tack and the muffled fall of hooves moving too slowly and too carefully to belong to anyone with honest business, and he was down the ladder and across the yard with his rifle in hand before the first rider had even reached the porch. "Hold there," Graham called out, leveling the Winchester at the shape in the darkness, close enough now that the moonlight caught the glint of a revolver in the rider's hand. "This is Chandler land. State your business or turn around." The rider hesitated, clearly not expecting armed resistance from what he'd likely been told was a woman living alone, and in that hesitation, a light flared to life in the house behind Graham as Harriet, roused by the voices, lit a lamp and came to the window with her late husband's old shotgun already in her hands, a weapon Graham had not even known she kept. "You heard him," Harriet called from the porch, her voice steadier than Graham would have believed possible given the circumstances. "Get off my land." Whether it was the sight of 2 armed defenders where they'd expected one unarmed widow, or simply cold calculation about the odds of a gunfight going their way, the 2 riders exchanged a low word Graham couldn't make out and then wheeled their horses and rode off into the dark without another word, leaving behind nothing but the fading sound of hooves and the sick, cold knowledge that Silas Vane had moved from mere suspicion into open aggression. Graham found Harriet still standing on the porch, the shotgun trembling now in her hands as the adrenaline of the moment began to drain away and leave fear in its place, and he crossed the yard and took the weapon gently from her grip and set it aside before pulling her into his arms. "They'll come back," Harriet whispered against his chest, her voice thick with the particular exhaustion of a fear carried too long. "Men like that always come back, Graham, and next time they'll come with more of them, and I can't lose this house. I can't lose the last thing Thomas built for us." "You won't lose it," Graham said, holding her tighter. "I promise you that, Harriet. Whatever it takes, you will not lose this house, and you will not lose that gold, and you will not lose me standing beside you while we fight for both." She lifted her face to his in the dim lamplight spilling from the window, and though her eyes were still bright with unshed tears, there was something fierce in them now too, something that had survived 11 years of careful solitude, and was not about to be extinguished by Sela's Vane or any man like him. "I love you," she said, the words coming out plain and unadorned, the way true things often do when a person is too frightened and too exhausted to dress them up in careful language. "I did not intend to love anyone again after Thomas Graham Brenner, and yet here I am, loving you anyway, and I find I have not one single regret about it." "I love you too," Graham said, and the words felt to him like the truest thing he had said in years, perhaps in his whole life. "I have loved you, I think, since the day you turned those cattle without so much as a word of instruction to me, and I have been trying very hard ever since to convince myself that a drifter with my history had no business loving a woman like you. I have failed entirely at convincing myself of any such thing." They stood together on the porch a long while, the fear of the night's visitors slowly giving way to something warmer and more certain between them, and when they finally went inside, it was with the unspoken understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together, as two people bound now by love as surely as they had ever been bound by circumstance. But the fight was not yet over, and both of them knew it. The next morning, Graham rode into Larkspur Creek at first light to speak with Sheriff Doss, and Harriet rode with him, unwilling to be left alone on the ranch after the previous night's visitors, and unwilling, too, to keep facing this threat in isolation the way she had faced so many threats before. Doss listened to the account of the two riders with a grim set to his jaw, and when Harriet finished, he sat back in his chair and studied the both of them for a long moment. "I've had my suspicions about Sela's Vane for a good while now," Doss admitted. "Man's got money enough that folks assume it makes him respectable, but respectable men don't send riders creeping onto a widow's land in the dark of night. Problem is, suspicion's not proof, and I can't arrest a man on suspicion alone, not one with Vane's connections to the territorial officials." "Then we need proof," Graham said. "Or we need to make it plain to Vane and anyone he might hire that this land isn't worth whatever risk he's willing to take for it." "There's another matter," Harriet said quietly, and both men turned to look at her. "I intend to tell you something, Sheriff, that I have kept hidden for 11 years, and I am trusting you to understand why I kept it hidden, and to help me now that hiding it is no longer enough to keep me safe." She told him, there in the small sheriff's office with its smell of gun oil and old coffee, the whole truth of Thomas Chandler's gold, the same truth she had told Graham that night in the kitchen, and Wyatt Doss listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving away nothing until she had finished. "Well," Doss said finally, exhaling slowly, "that explains a good deal I've wondered about you these 8 years, Mrs. Chandler, and I'll say plainly, I don't blame you one bit for keeping it quiet. A woman alone with that kind of secret would be a fool to announce it to the territory. What I need now," Harriet said, "is a way to end this threat from Vane without ending it in gunfire, if such a thing is possible. I have spent enough years hiding to know that hiding forever is no longer an option, not with him circling this close. But I would rather find another way than risk Graham's life, or my own, in a fight I might avoid." Doss considered this for a long moment, tapping one finger against the worn wood of his desk. "There's a territorial land office inspector due through Laramie next month," he said slowly, "conducting a survey ahead of that railroad spur everyone's been chattering about for 2 years. If Vane's counting on getting your land cheap before that survey settles the water rights question once and for all, there might be a way to use his own greed against him. If the water rights on your section get formally recorded and protected ahead of that survey, in your name, permanent and clear, Vane's whole scheme falls apart, because he'll have no legal path left to force you out, gold or no gold, and no reason left to keep sending men creeping around your property in the dark. And how does a widow with 40 head of cattle pay for a formal survey and a legal filing on short notice? Harriet asked, without drawing exactly the kind of attention I've spent 11 years avoiding. Das looked at her for a long moment, understanding passing between them without either needing to say the word gold aloud in front of the open office door. Careful, he said simply. The same way you've done everything else. But I'd wager it's a far smaller risk to spend a little of what's under your floor protecting the whole of what's under your floor, than to keep hoping Vane gives up and rides away on his own. It was sound advice, and Harriet knew it, though the thought of drawing on the buried fortune for anything beyond the slow trickle Thomas had planned still sat uneasily with her. An old habit of caution, not easily set aside even now that circumstances demanded it. That evening, back at the ranch, Harriet and Graham knelt together in the kitchen for the first time since Graham had discovered the loose board, and together they pried up the floorboards and lifted the oilcloth-wrapped tin box that had sat in that dark space for 11 long years. The box was heavier than Graham expected, and when Harriet opened it in the lamplight, the sight of it, coin and folded currency both, was enough to steal the breath from him entirely, the physical reality of a fortune he had, until that moment, only imagined in the abstract. "There's more here than I realized," Graham said quietly. "Harriet, this is enough to buy half the county." "Thomas always said it was enough to change our whole lives, if we were patient with it," Harriet said, looking down at the box with an expression Graham could not quite read, grief and relief, and something like release all tangled together. "I have been patient with it for 11 years. I think it is past time we let it change something." They counted out a careful sum that night, enough to pay the surveying and filing fees Das had described, enough to hire a lawyer in Laramie discreet enough not to ask too many questions, and enough, Harriet decided after a long moment of consideration, to finally, truly pay off the last of the small debt at the Laramie Bank, freeing her from that particular worry once and for all. They wrapped the remainder back in its oilcloth and returned it to the earth beneath the floor, and Graham noticed, as they set the boards back in place, that Harriet's hands did not tremble the way they once might have at the thought of the fortune resting so near the surface. Something had shifted in her that night, some long-carried weight finally beginning to lift. The following weeks were a careful dance of quiet errands and discreet arrangements. Graham rode to Laramie with Harriet at his side, and together they met with a lawyer named Ambrose Kettering, an older man with a reputation for discretion who had helped more than one rancher in the territory settle water disputes without undue attention. Kettering listened to their situation, examined the old land deeds Thomas Chandler had filed years before, and assured them that a formal survey and filing, done properly and swiftly, would settle the water rights question beyond any legal challenge Silas Vane might attempt. Vane's tried this sort of maneuver before in other territories, Kettering told them, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed the paperwork. He counts on isolation and uncertainty to pressure landholders into selling cheap before anyone thinks to formalize their claims. Once the water rights are recorded properly, Mrs. Chandler, there is very little he can do beyond making you a fair offer, which I suspect holds considerably less appeal for a man like him than the alternative he has apparently been considering. The survey was scheduled for the 3rd week of May, and in the meantime, Harriet paid off the remaining balance at the Laramie Bank in a manner as unremarkable as she could manage, spread across 2 visits rather than one, presented as the ordinary proceeds of a good calving season, combined with the sale of a small parcel of unused grazing land at the edge of her section, a plausible enough story that raised no eyebrows among the bank clerks who processed it. Silas Vane, for his part, seemed to sense that something had shifted, though he could not have known precisely what. He did not send riders again in the dead of night, not directly, but Harriet and Graham both noticed, in the weeks that followed, a persistent watchfulness to the man's presence in town, a way his gaze followed them when they rode in for supplies, a coolness in his greeting when their paths crossed on the street that suggested a predator forced to reconsider his approach rather than a man who had abandoned his intentions altogether. It was in the final days before the survey, with the tension in Larkspur Creek drawn tight as a bowstring, that Silas Vane made one last, desperate attempt to secure what he wanted before the law could put it permanently beyond his reach. He came not with hired riders this time, but alone on a gray gelding, arriving at the Chandler Ranch in the late afternoon with an expression Harriet had never seen on him before, something almost like fear beneath the practiced calm of his features. "Mrs. Chandler," he said, dismounting this time, a courtesy he had never before extended, "I understand you've engaged a lawyer in Laramie. I understand a territorial surveyor is due through next week to settle the water rights on your section permanently." "You understand correctly," Harriet said, standing on her porch with Graham a careful step behind her, his hand resting near the rifle he'd left leaning against the porch rail, close enough to reach in an instant if the need arose. "I will make you one final offer," Vane said, and there was something almost desperate in the way he said it now, the smooth confidence of their earlier meetings entirely gone. $6 an acre, Mrs. Chandler, nearly double what this land is worth to anyone but me. I will have the papers drawn up tonight if you accept." "Why the sudden generosity, Mr. Vane?" Graham asked, stepping forward slightly. "Seems a strange time to double an offer, unless something's changed that makes this land worth a good deal more to you than mere pasture and water." Vane's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing, and Harriet watched something behind his eyes calculate and recalculate, weighing how much to reveal against how much he still hoped to gain. "I invested heavily," Vane said finally, the words coming out clipped and bitter, "on information that this land held value beyond its water. Information I paid dearly for, and which I have staked a good deal of my remaining capital against. If that information proves false, or if the value it points toward passes permanently beyond my reach through some legal filing, I stand to lose considerably more than the price of this land, Mrs. Chandler. I am asking you, plainly now, man to woman, to sell to me before that filing takes place, and to name whatever price within reason will make you agree to it." It was, Harriet realized with a strange, cold clarity, as close to an honest confession as Silas Vane would ever offer, an admission that he had indeed learned or guessed closely enough at the fortune buried beneath her floor, and had built his entire scheme around seizing the land before she could either move the fortune or protect it beyond his reach. "No, Mr. Vane," Harriet said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. "I will not sell this land to you, not for $6 an acre, not for 60. Whatever you believe lies on this property belongs to me, and it will remain mine, and if you have staked your fortune on taking it from me by whatever means you imagined, I suggest you consider now, while you still have the chance, whether that fortune is worth losing entirely, in a legal filing that will make any further attempt on this property a matter for the territorial marshal, rather than a mere dispute between neighbors." Vane stared at her for a long moment, his face working through something that might have been rage, or might have been the slow, sick realization of a man watching his careful scheme collapse in real time. Then, without another word, he mounted his gray gelding and rode away, and this time, watching him go, Harriet felt none of the old fear that had haunted her through his previous visits. Something in her had finally hardened past the point of fear into something closer to resolve. "He'll try something before that surveyor arrives," Graham said quietly, watching Vane's retreating figure. "A man that desperate doesn't simply ride away and accept defeat." "Then we had best be ready for him," Harriet said. They spent the following days in careful preparation, Graham riding into Larkspur Creek to speak once more with Sheriff Doss, who agreed to station a deputy within riding distance of the Chandler Ranch through the remaining nights before the survey, and Harriet, for her part, insisting on keeping both the shotgun and Thomas's old revolver loaded and within reach at all times, a habit of vigilance she had nearly let slip during the peaceful weeks of her growing love with Graham, but which she now resumed with the grim determination of a woman who understood, better than most, exactly what was at stake. The attempt came on the night before the surveyor was due to arrive, and it came, as Graham had predicted, with more desperation than caution behind it. 3 riders this time, not 2, arriving well past midnight under a moon nearly full enough to betray their approach across the open pasture, though the deputy Das had stationed a half-mile down the road spotted them first and rode hard for the ranch house, arriving just moments before the riders themselves, shouting a warning that woke both Harriet and Graham from the light, uneasy sleep they had each been managing in recent nights. What followed was chaotic and frightening, though it was, in the end, mercifully brief. The 3 riders, realizing they had lost the element of surprise the moment the deputy's shout rang out across the yard, hesitated at the fence line rather than pressing forward into what was now clearly a defended position, with Graham on the porch with his rifle raised, and the deputy dismounting near the barn with his own weapon drawn, and Harriet, at the window, with the shotgun steady in her hands despite the wild pounding of her heart. "Last chance to turn around," Graham called out into the darkness, his voice carrying clear and hard across the yard, "before this turns into something none of us walk away from easily." There was a long, tense silence, the horses shifting and snorting in the moonlight, and then, to the relief of everyone in that yard, the riders made the same calculation the 2 earlier visitors had made, weighing the risk of an armed and prepared defense against whatever payment Vane had promised them, and finding the risk too steep. They wheeled and rode off into the dark, and this time the deputy managed to get close enough before they scattered to recognize one of them, a man named Cole Riggins, who had done rough work for Silas Vane before, according to whispers around Larkspur Creek that had never before amounted to proof. It was enough, combined with Vane's own half-confession at the ranch days earlier, for Sheriff Das to ride out to Vane's property the following morning with a warrant a territorial judge had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to issue on the strength of the accumulated evidence. Vane was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit trespass and assault, charges that would not, in the end, put him away for many years given the limits of frontier justice and the quality of lawyers his remaining money could still afford, but which were enough, combined with the public shame of the arrest itself and the swift completion of the water rights survey that same week, to end his threat to the Chandler Ranch entirely. He sold his remaining land holdings along the river within the year and left the territory altogether, and Harriet Chandler never saw Silas Vane again. The survey itself, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after the tension of the preceding weeks, a quiet, careful process conducted by a patient territorial official who measured and recorded and filed the water rights to Harriet's section permanently and beyond legal challenge, exactly as Ambrose Kettering had promised. When it was finished, Harriet stood in her own yard in the bright, ordinary light of a May afternoon and felt something in her chest unclench that had been clenched, she realized, for 11 long years. "It's done," she said to Graham, who stood beside her watching the surveyor's wagon roll away down the road. "The land is mine, truly mine, beyond any question anyone could raise against it, and the gold is still safe beneath the floor, and no one in this territory has the faintest proof of what lies there, and I do not believe anyone ever will, so long as we're careful." "You've spent your whole life being careful, Harriet," Graham said, turning to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I wonder if it might not be time to spend a little of that fortune on something other than caution." She looked up at him, understanding the shape of what he was asking even before he found the words for it, and something warm and hopeful bloomed in her chest, a feeling she had not allowed herself in so many years that it took her a moment to recognize it fully as joy. "What did you have in mind, Mr. Brenner?" she asked, though her voice was not entirely steady. Graham knelt, right there in the yard, in the dust and the bright May sunlight, and Harriet felt her breath catch entirely. "Harriet Chandler," he said, "I came to this territory a drifter with nothing to my name but a tired horse and a rifle I'd gone hungry to afford. And I have found in you more than I ever believed a man like me had any right to hope for. I love you more than I have words to properly say. I love the way you turn cattle without a single wasted motion, and the way you've carried a burden alone for 11 years that would have broken lesser people, and the way you looked at me that first night in your kitchen and decided, against every hard lesson your life had taught you, to trust me with the truth of what lies beneath your floor. I am asking you now, with the whole of my heart, to marry me and to let me spend the whole of my life proving myself worthy of that trust." Harriet did not hesitate, not for a single second, though tears were already spilling freely down her cheeks by the time she answered him. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Graham Brenner, I will marry you, and I will love you for the whole of whatever years we're given. And I think Thomas himself would be glad to know that the house he built for me did not stand empty of love forever." They were married in June, in the small church at Larkspur Creek, with Sheriff Wyatt Doss standing as witness and half the town turning out for the small celebration that followed at the saloon. A warmth and generosity from the community that Harriet had not fully appreciated until she saw it gathered in one room, glasses raised in her honor. She wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton she had sewn herself in the evenings leading up to the wedding, and Graham wore a new coat he had bought with money earned honestly from his months of work on the ranch, unwilling, even now, to draw on Harriet's buried fortune for something so purely his own to give her. They used the gold slowly in the years that followed, exactly as Thomas Chandler had once planned, though now there were two of them to plan its careful use rather than one woman carrying the whole weight of the secret alone. New stock, bought a little at a time from different sellers across 2 counties. A proper barn, built the following summer, sturdy enough to last generations. A small addition to the house itself. A second bedroom that Harriet insisted upon before either of them had any particular reason to need it, though she suspected, even as she requested it, exactly what that reason would eventually become. Their first child, a son they named Thomas Graham Brenner in honor of both the man who had built the house and the man who had helped Harriet fill it again with love, was born in the spring of 1881, nearly 2 years after Graham had first ridden into Larkspur Creek. He had his mother's clear gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and Harriet wept with joy the first time she held him, thinking of Thomas Chandler and the years of loneliness that had preceded this moment, and feeling, for the first time since her husband's death, that some circle of grief had finally closed and made room for new beginnings. A daughter followed 2 years after that, whom they named Eleanor, after Graham's own mother long past, whom he had spoken of only rarely but always with tenderness during the quiet evenings of their courtship. And 2 years after Eleanor came a second son, William, round-faced and loud-voiced from his very first breath, filling the house with a boisterous energy that Harriet often said reminded her of nothing so much as the cattle he would one day help his father and older brother tend. The gold beneath the kitchen floor dwindled over the years, spent carefully on the things that mattered most. The ranch expanded to nearly 200 head of cattle by the time young Thomas Graham was old enough to ride the fence lines himself. The house grown large and warm, and full of the particular chaos of a family that had fought hard for its happiness, and did not take a single day of it for granted. What remained of the fortune, by the time their children were grown, was set aside quietly for each of them, a legacy Harriet and Graham disclosed to their children only once they were old enough to understand both the value of it and the terrible burden of secrecy that had once surrounded it. A burden neither parent wished their children to carry alone the way Harriet had once carried it. Your grandfather Thomas found that gold with nothing but patience and hard work and no small amount of fear, Harriet told her children, one evening many years later, the 3 of them grown now, gathered around the very kitchen table where the secret had first been shared with Graham so long ago. And your father and I have spent our whole marriage learning that a fortune means little if it costs you the people you love to protect it. Use what we leave you wisely, and never let money make you forget the people standing beside you. Graham, older now, silver beginning to show at his temples in a way that only made Harriet love him more, reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture he had made 1,000 times over their years together. And Harriet thought, as she so often did in the quiet moments of her full and happy life, of the drifter who had ridden into her scattering cattle on an ordinary autumn afternoon and never truly left again. The house Thomas Chandler had built still stood, sturdy as ever, decades of Wyoming winters unable to shake its foundations, and beneath its kitchen floor, where a fortune had once lain hidden in fear and loneliness, there remained now only the ordinary, comfortable emptiness of a family home, the gold long since spent on the things that had always mattered most. A marriage built on trust, children raised in love rather than secrecy, and a life that Harriet Chandler, once so alone in her careful vigilance, had never imagined she would be lucky enough to live. On the evening of their 20th anniversary, Graham and Harriet sat together on the porch of that same house, watching their grown children and their children's own small families gather in the yard for a celebration that had drawn nearly the whole of Larkspur Creek, the town having grown considerably in the 2 decades since the railroad spur finally arrived, exactly as everyone had once predicted. Though by then, the water rights dispute that had once threatened to unmake Harriet's whole life had long since become nothing more than an old story told at gatherings like this one, a piece of local history rather than a living fear. "Do you ever think about it?" Harriet asked softly, watching young Thomas Graham, now a man of 20 with a wife of his own, laughing with his younger siblings near the barn. "How different everything might have gone if you'd simply ridden past that scattering herd instead of stopping to help." Graham considered this for a long moment, his hand finding hers in the fading evening light, the same warm, steady grip it had always been. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't believe I ever truly could have ridden past Harriet. Some things a person simply can't ride away from, even if they don't yet understand why. I believe some part of me knew, that very first day, that I'd found something in you worth stopping for, worth staying for, worth building the whole rest of my life around." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the two of them watching the golden light settle over the ranch they had built together, the children and grandchildren they had raised in love rather than fear, and the house that had once guarded a fortune in secret and now guarded in its place something far more valuable and far less easily buried. A lifetime of love, hard-won and faithfully kept, that neither hardship nor greed nor the passing of years had ever once managed to diminish. "I'm glad you stopped," Harriet said quietly. "So am I," Graham answered, and pressed a soft kiss to the crown of her hair, and together they watched the sun set over Wyoming territory, two people who had once been strangers and had become, through hardship and courage and a shared secret buried beneath a kitchen floor, each other's whole and unshakable home.